From the heart of Appalachia in the foothills of West Virginia, this is the Mountain Musket. I'm Josiah Batten.
I am Seth Campbell.
And I'm Justin Seibert.
Today's episode, we're going to be talking about one of the big issues you see coming up quite a bit today in light of COVID-19, and that is the issue of false teachers.
Okay.
This is pretty important, I think. Just I'll lay some groundwork and then we'll open it up. Pretty important because, A, you see so many people warning against virtually everyone. Everyone is a false teacher. Everyone who doesn't agree with me on every single specific point, down to the dot and tittle, is a false teacher. And then you have the opposite end. No one is a false teacher. It is never appropriate to correct or disagree with someone's doctrine. You should never, ever correct anyone who's any type of teacher or pastor or anything else. So
do not
let's
touch
start
the words
with
anointed.
Yeah, we're going to get to that. Yes. We're going to get to that.
The 11th commandment.
Yeah. So let's start with the basics though. What is a false teacher?
Well, the Bible uses the term false teacher, but it also primarily uses the term wolf. So the kind of language that the Bible uses is one of a people who understood the analogous relationship that we have to nature and the farming and all that kind of stuff, and the shepherding community. If we are Christ's sheep, there are sheep and goats, and they travel together, but they need to be divided because they're different. And Jesus uses this example, but we also have in there Paul talks about ravenous wolves, that there are ravenous wolves among you. So it's someone who is a danger to the sheep. It's someone who, with the things that they're saying and with the things that they're claiming, with the things that they're teaching and preaching, are a danger to the sheep, and danger to the sheep because they threaten to tear them away from the fold. They threaten God's people. They threaten the purity of the message. It is a dangerous thing to tolerate. In the same way that it would be dangerous to tolerate a wolf in your sheepfold, it's dangerous to tolerate a false teacher among God's people. So, from a really like super basic. Now that doesn't necessarily define what a false teacher is, like what it is that they do or what they say. Right. But it certainly defines the way in which the biblical writers understood false teachers. Who are they? What are they doing? And why should we care? Well, we should care in the same way we should care if a wolf got among the sheep. So I have chickens, right? And I just built this chicken house, and every inch of that chicken house, I made sure I cinched it down. I put hardware cloth and tin and all that, and every inch of that thing, because the last thing I want is something to get in there. I don't want a weasel to get in there. I don't want to get a possum to get in there. Because the last thing in the world I want is something to get in there and get my chickens. It'll tear them up. It will absolutely tear them up. And so that's the way that the biblical writers see false teaching and false teachers among God's people.
It's a very earthy view of it, right? Like you said, it ties into that culture's connection to animal husbandry and how that all worked in their society. And it was your example was wonderful because I helped you cut the wood for that chicken coop. I feel very accomplished. But more importantly, you mentioned that you got a plug, shameless plug. I'm a horrible carpenter. How did it turn out, by the way? Good.
Yeah,
does everything fit?
It's great. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. But so you mentioned that you were like blocking these predators from coming in. So does it follow that the church is sort of responsible of blocking these predators that are coming in? And does that mean we should have maybe barriers to entry for teachers and leaders in the church?
I certainly think Paul understood it that way. I think one of the things he says in Acts to the church at Ephesus when he's leaving, he says almost prophetically, there will be wolves among you. They will come. They will rise up from among your midst. Beware of them. They will come. There's debate about what exactly and who exactly he's talking about there. But yeah, this is in the same way that you would not want a weasel to get into your chicken house, or wouldn't want a wolf to get into your sheepfold. This is something that you want to ward off. You want to ward against. You want to, and to go back to what Josiah said earlier, the last thing we want to be is are the people that are highlighting every difference and saying, if you're not like us, then you're not a Christian. We've had episodes on that before. But on the flip side, we don't want to say that you can never be in error. And I have a feeling that that's going to be the tenor of this episode.
Right. So you can be too ecumenical, is the way of putting that, right? You can be too kind, give more grace than Jesus would have given, so to speak, which is a mistake I think a lot of Christians in America make. So you mentioned the whole unity thing, and we can't just think, well, just because Presbyterians baptize babies, they're heretics and they're false teachers, and just because Pentecostals believe that there are other, the spiritual gifts are active today, they're not heretics just because of that. I guess, what is the hallmark of a false teacher? What do they do? Now that we know what they are, what do they do?
I would say they teach something not just that's wrong, but something that's fundamentally wrong, in the sense of you have what we would call maybe, first order doctrines or primary doctrines as opposed to secondary. Okay, disagreement on secondary things, that's typically what defines denominations. Okay, so Presbyterians differ from Baptists on certain things, and Baptists differ from Pentecostals. Those define denominations. We don't throw the heretic word around over those things.
Sure.
But disagreement on the primary issues, or in the case of the cults, they frequently will take, they'll claim to be part of a parent religion, in our case Christianity, but deny one or more fundamental teachings of that religion.
And gloss over it as well.
Or they'll use the same language, but significantly change what it actually means.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and that's all good lies, right? Like, all good lies have 75% truth. It's just that little bit of a lie mixed in, and then it's perfect. You can barely tell. It's like that you can't taste the aftertaste. There's no bitterness.
So the word orthodox, literally means straight or true teaching. So an orthodontist, right, is someone who makes your teeth straight, right?
That's fantastic.
Dente is
teeth straightener.
Teeth, and ortho means straight. That's what ortho means. So orthodox means the straight teaching, the right teaching, the true teaching. Heterodox, hetero means the opposite, means different. So if we are heterosexual, that means we are attracted to the opposite sex. Heterodox is someone who's teaching something that is the opposite of the truth, something that is. So I wouldn't say that a false teacher is unorthodox. I would say a false teacher is heterodox. They are teaching the opposite of the truth. They are teaching the opposite of what needs to be taught.
Interesting.
So on an issue like the gospel, and I bring this up because you frequently hear the defense, well, this person is preaching the gospel, they're teaching the gospel, you shouldn't criticize them. What is the gospel?
Two halves, one big picture, man. Two halves, one big picture. I some people disagree with me on this, but it's inherently pretty simple. I know you and I agree on that, Josiah. But it's two parts to one larger picture, and the gospel is the good news. So the good news is that you are saved, redeemed in God's sight. You have an advocate. It's great. You need to have bad news for there to be a reason for the good news. The bad news is that you're condemned in God's sight outside of Christ. So that's the gospel. Simply put, like, you want a layman, that's it. Like, good news, Jesus Christ came here to die for his people. All those who believe in him will not perish. The bad news was, if you're not in Christ, you're condemned. That's my definition. I stand by it.
Seth, do you want to add anything?
So I think, if you're going to boil it down to its simplest form, it's the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And obviously, there's things that are attached to that, as far as the sinfulness of man and all that stuff. But it's 1 Corinthians 15 stuff. 1 Corinthians 15, like if Christ has not been raised, then what are we doing? Those kind of things.
Right.
But baked into that, obviously, is the sinfulness of man. Baked into that is the Trinity. Baked into that is a lot of other things. And you have to, and the people who raise that issue have grounding to stand on, because Paul says, in Philippians, he says, Christ is being preached. Christ is being proclaimed. Whether for good or for ill, whether for human gain or for spiritual gain, for whatever reason, Christ is being proclaimed, and for that I rejoice. And so we have to, as we try to deal with false teachers and false teaching and all that, yes, we have to wrestle with that, and we have to ward off and ward against it. But we also have to take what Paul says pretty seriously when he says, I rejoice at the gospel being proclaimed. If it's an undiluted and unadulterated gospel, then maybe we should, not that we shouldn't criticize, but we should maybe couch our criticism a little bit differently and not throw the word false teacher or false teaching out. That's a strong word. That's like using the word rape just for, this is the modern thing is everything is rape. So you could go.
I was mentally raped.
Mentally raped. Yeah, you go. I mean, it's popular even among like younger kids now, middle schoolers or whatever, that they'll have like these really loud music or really loud blast or something on YouTube, and they'll call it an ear rape. Well, time out. Like, you can't just throw that word around and make it mean
language means things.
Right. Words have meanings. Right. Words have meanings. And so we have to when we use those terms and when we use that word, it's a serious word and we have to use it seriously. But on the flip side, you have to also recognize that those things exist. It's not so we don't want to make the definition so lofty that no one can ever reach it.
So have you ever heard, either of you ever heard, someone that you would consider a false teacher actually give a real undiluted presentation of the gospel?
Yeah, no, that's rough.
That's a tough question.
Yeah,
I usually I don't make it a habit of listening to them.
Right, and not to mention that I have a pretty high bar for false teacher as well. I mean, that's like, and Seth, you corrected me on this, like, I don't know, I feel like a year ago. Like Andy Stanley. Like I used to think he was kind of a false teacher, but I'm like, you know what? He's just probably really unorthodox, as opposed to, like you said, heterodox.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing is, are we dealing, and this is a nuanced thing, but are we dealing with a false teacher or dealing with a false teaching? And I think that's so you can have a true teacher, a qualified teacher who gives a false teaching, and then when I think my problem, the problem comes when you have a teacher who starts to double down and triple down on false teaching. That's when things start getting a little wonky.
Yeah. So the reason I ask that question is anytime I've ever been critical of any type of teacher or minister or evangelist, and people come back with the retort, well, they're preaching the gospel, I'm like, I never heard them preach the gospel. Like, I've watched their videos, I've listened to their sermons, I've never heard them preach the gospel.
Well, the burden of proof at that point would be on the other person. The burden of proof would be on that other person to say, if you're going to tell me that this person has preached the undiluted gospel and they have just had a false teaching. I think of Stephen Furtick's. That's the one thing that Jesus can't do. Like, Jesus is unable to. I think it was override your unbelief. He is unable.
Yeah.
And I had conversations with provisionalists and things like that, and they would say would never have used that language.
Right.
And try to just give him a pass, and he worded it, whatever. Okay, fine. But if they're going to claim he is not a false teacher because, or whoever it is not a false teacher because they faithfully proclaim the gospel, and they quote that Philippians passage, then it's the burden of proof is on them at that point, because they're the one making the positive claim. If they're making the positive claim, this person's not a false teacher. Look at how they preach the gospel.
Yeah, you've already provided your evidence at this point to give a prima facie case that, like, listen, this guy is a false teacher. If someone wants to rebut that prima facie case, they have to provide rebuttal evidence.
Right. So if you want to,
that's like basics.
Right. So if you want me to believe that T.D. Jakes is not a modalist, like I believe T.D. Jakes is a false teacher because he's non-Trinitarian.
Yeah.
That's one reason among many, but that's one. If you're going to claim that he is not a false teacher because he is not a modalist, he is Trinitarian, then the burden of proof is now on you. Okay. Mm-hmm. Prove to me, show me, give me evidence. Don't say go watch his sermon. Don't go. No. If you're gonna say that, then you have to show me. Send me the clip. Don't expect me to go comb for it, because if you're trying to convince me that he's not a false teacher, then show me he's not a false teacher.
Mm-hmm. Right.
For our listeners,
and maybe there's a distinction to be had here. You know, I'm sorry that I talked over anyone, but the with someone like T.D. Jakes, right? Like it'd probably be really easy to get a 10-second video of him sharing the gospel in its simpleness. But it always seems that, like, especially T.D. Jake,
you'd be surprised.
I'm being charitable. There's always something hitched onto the end of it, right? Like,
okay, finish your point, Sarah.
You guys are full snark. No, you guys are full snark this evening. The point is with people like Jakes and other especially prosperity teachers, they often have something hitched to, no pun intended, Andy Stanley, to their gospel message. And that's a big distinction, because, sure, for 20 seconds he preached the gospel, and now we're going to go into how, like, God, through the gospel, is going to bless you monetarily. Whoa. We talking about the same gospel?
Mm-hmm. Right. And
that's just me, though.
That's a big thing, is if people are adding something to their understanding of the gospel, they might have the core in there, but then they add something to it and say this is still the gospel. Like, if you don't have this added, you don't have the full gospel, right? That's really problematic.
So this seems really complicated for our listeners here. I gotta be honest with you guys. Like, if we could just, I want to formalize this so that the lay person can be like, okay, where's a good place for me to reference for if someone believes X, this could be a false teacher. Let me go let me go talk with my church. By the way, you're not alone. You got your church, your elders, your other church members you can consult with. What do you recommend there?
Well, before we answer that, I want to go back just real quick and say that
put a pin in
the entire issue in the book of Galatians was that you had people adding things to the gospel. That was the whole issue.
Yes.
That you had to be circumcised, you had to be Jewish by culture, you had to be, obey the food laws and all. You had to do those things in order to be saved, or you weren't saved. And I don't know that prosperity teachers ever get there. They certainly flirt with that line of, if you're not wealthy, if you're not blessed, then you might want to start asking questions about your salvation or whatever. I don't know that I've ever heard them say you're not saved, anything like that. But
I've heard them say they don't have enough faith. Yeah, don't have enough faith.
But when Paul talks about those Judaizers in Galatians, he uses the word pseudo-delphi or pseudo-delphoi. Pseudo means fake, means pretend. Yep. We know what pseudo means. And Delphos is brother. The city Philadelphia, philia means love. Delphos is brother, the city of brotherly love.
City of brotherly love.
And so Paul uses that word, pseudo-delphoi, for a false brother. That's literally, when we're talking about a false teacher, that's what we're talking about. When we talk about a wolf among the sheep, that's what we're talking about. You're
talking about an apostate then.
I'm talking about a false brother. I'm talking about someone who claims to be of us but is not of us.
Okay.
I'm talking. So going back to your point, what are the things we should be watching for? Well, I mean, the big E on the eye chart is a denial of the resurrection. I mean, you deny the resurrection,
Right.
you deny you deny any part or facet of the Trinity, Trinitarian language. I mean, these are the easy ones. So Mormons are not Christians. Jehovah's Witnesses are not Christians.
Right.
United Pentecostals are not Christians because they're not Trinitarian.
Yeah. That's so and then that's all pretty much summarized in like the Apostles' Creed.
So that
Right.
For our listeners.
Yeah, that leads me to a question I want to ask is, what do you guys think is the role of things like the creeds, the confessions, catechisms in helping
Right.
people understand and guard against false teachings and false teachers?
So I have
this
I have a kid story, right? So my 4-year-old, my wife relayed this story to me, so I'm going to relay it, but it's going to be really clunky. It was better when she told me, right? So the 4-year-old was talking and said something like, I drew for the 6-year-old, and I have deeper conversations. And so I drew her the triangle with the circle to explain the Trinity. The three persons of the Trinity on each of the points of the triangle, and then in the is and the is not and all that.
Right.
And so I was explaining that to her, and the 4-year-old is kind of shoulder surfing and watching and of course absorbing more than I realized. And of course we do catechism and everything, so they know one God in three persons. They know that language.
Right.
Right.
And so she was talking, and I don't remember how it came up, but she said something like she instead of using son, she used kid. The father is not the kid, the kid is not the dad, or something like that. Something wonky like that. But my wife knew to follow it up with the catechism question of how many gods do we have? We have one God. And how many persons does this one God exist? God exists in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And then you nip that. You at that point in time, especially when they're that age, that rote memorization just drills it in. So
Yeah.
I think long answer to a short question. What are the catechisms and creeds for? They're the guardrails that keep you from heresy.
Yeah.
That's what they are.
Yeah, they're the tin wire. They're the tin plating and the fence that you put around your chicken coop. They protect generationally, if they're regarded generationally. Right now we have a problem with that. But the confessional Christianity is coming back again. If they are passed down and regarded as obviously secondary to Scripture, and man's attempt to faithful parallel interpretation of Scripture, they're useful because you can use the catechisms, like Seth said. I use the Westminster Shorter Catechism with our kids. Try to get it done 3 times a week. I've been doing it more during COVID, but I think it's important. It roots you in those basic fundamental beliefs that if they didn't exist, Christianity would otherwise be invalidated.
Yeah. And
I think that's where.
yeah, you mentioned them being secondary to Scripture, and I want to clarify for people, we're not. I frequently have heard people say, "Well, I only believe the Bible. I don't want anything else." And I want to emphasize the creeds, the confessions, catechisms. These are just summaries of biblical doctrine and biblical teaching, because it's hard to remember the entire Bible, right? All 1189 chapters at once. Okay, that's hard to do. So we summarize some of the salient points in the confessions and the creeds and catechisms, just because it makes it easier to remember the big picture, the big issues, right? That's the whole point.
It's just, I mean, if you guys get, to our listeners, if you guys want to go just like, they're free on the internet, go read the Westminster Confession, the anything to do with the Heidelberg Catechism is great. You'll be surprised what you find in there. It's really enriching. Just the way these people thought all those years ago. It kind of makes me feel bad.
Well, and
Why am I not this learning?
it roots your Christianity. The Christianity isn't something we thought up 5 minutes ago. It's not something that it's not something that's a flash in a pan. It anchors you to something. It anchors you to not only to a historical church, but a worldwide church, a church that goes beyond your. Oftentimes, we as Americans, Westerners, but Americans in particular, have a tendency to think of Christianity only in American terms.
Yes.
That if the American church withers and dies, that the gospel itself withers and dies. Well, no, that's not true.
Yeah.
And the creeds and catechisms help anchor you in that. I mean, where's the church of Hippo now? Right, like Augustine of Hippo. We know Augustine's name, but where's the Church of Hippo? Well, it's gone. It's not there anymore.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And so in the same way, there may be a day when the church in Albuquerque or the church in Seattle or the church in DC is nobody remembers. Nobody. It's a long forgotten memory. But those truths, those things that we stand on, those creeds, those confessions, that those expositions of Scripture, those guardrails, are things that last. Those are the things that last.
So what about?
So yeah, don't try to go it alone.
Yeah. What about people who would say it's unloving or unkind to even call someone a false teacher or call something a false teaching? How do we respond to it? It's unloving, it's unkind, it's not humble.
Yeah, I mean, you gotta like, what do you mean by unkind? Because in my opinion, it's unkind to let a wolf stay in the same pen that all my brothers are staying in, especially if I see it. If discernment happens to be my gift, and I'm like, whoa, that's not right. And if I don't do anything, that's pretty selfish and cowardly, in my opinion. And if you love your neighbor, you warn them of the danger, I think.
But you don't want to make the wolf
I mean, I would just. Well, yeah, that's secular nonsense. It's secular. It's pop psychology nonsense. Maybe.
Yeah,
Christianity. We're always gonna make people mad. We're literally telling everyone we're right and they're wrong.
Like,
it's the point.
Yeah, you can't. You that the person that would argue that way certainly has not read the Bible. In no way can they follow the Jesus in the Gospels. Who stares down Pharisees and says, "You follow the traditions of men, not the word of God."
He came to purify his people.
I mean, the Apostle Paul and his writings. I mean, even the Ezekiel on the watchman on the watchtower. If he sleeps while the enemy comes, the blood is on his hands.
Yep.
If he sleeps while the enemy comes, the blood is on his hands. And Ezekiel says, "I am the watchman on the watchtower, and if you don't wake up when I call, that's on you. But I can't be quiet about this. I have to say something." So the person that would argue that way, and it's a bit of a caricature, I get that, but the person that would think or argue that way is certainly not someone that's familiar with any major character in the Bible, let alone Jesus himself.
I don't think it's a caricature, but
go ahead, Josiah. What?
I said I don't think it's a caricature, but I have plenty of real life examples.
Yeah,
no, I've seen it on your page, especially. But it's disheartening.
Jesus got killed, guys. The dude was murdered.
You
follow a man who was murdered. What do you think is going to happen? He wasn't, and contrary to popular belief, he wasn't murdered because he was super nice. You don't murder nice people.
Yeah.
That's not how it works.
Right.
You murder dangerous people. You murder people who are threats. That's what you do.
Yeah. He was murdered because he was able to go to a council and a trial and rebuff everyone. Mm-hmm. That's why, you know what I mean? Like, he was a threat to them, like you said, Seth. It's crazy that people can't draw the connection of like, at some point or another, you're not going to be nice when you're telling the truth. And that's a hard truth, no pun intended. I think a lot of especially American Christians have trouble with, like, when, I'm not saying you go out to everyone on the street and say, are you divorced? You shouldn't be divorced, or something like that. That's a little ridiculous. But at the same time, like, if you knew someone that was, for example, doing drugs, like, you wouldn't just, honey, go do your heroin, sweetie. Kidding me? They're gonna die.
Right. So as a follow-up to that, I've brought that point up in discussions with people in the past that, well, look what Jesus himself did. And some of the responses I've got have been things like, and I only bring this up because I think it's popular. I don't think this is just one person that thinks this way.
Okay.
But the response I've got is, well, we're supposed to follow the example of Jesus, but we don't have the same authority as he did to rebuke false teachers or to take those actions.
All
I feel like
heaven and earth I give to you, there.
Right.
Make disciples of all nations.
All.
Yeah. Not all, Seth.
All doesn't.
What are you, a
all.
textualist?
Yeah, what are you, a biblicist? Yes.
Yeah, right. Like, do you read words and think they have a systematic meaning? Come on, man. Get out.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, we do. But not to be obviously God, not to be the God man himself, God incarnate that came down to, save us from our sin. But we have the authority. Even the apostles told us that we're to call those people out and protect the church if we love the church. So that's crap. Next,
have nothing to do with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rebuke them. Right. That's
right.
Like, that seems pretty straightforward to me.
And
yeah,
guys, it seems to me that those kind of people are usually red letter Christians. But even when you just boil it down to the red letters, like, there's some red letters that you're gonna have to start crossing out some red letters, which I think is a sham anyway. But you're gonna have to. You still like, Jesus said some audacious stuff.
Yeah.
He wasn't just,
and he said them.
He wasn't a flower child. Like, that's not how.
Yeah. And he said them with authority and with purpose, right? Like, it wasn't just like.
That was one of the things they said about him when he was teaching. He was, who is this who speaks with such authority? Which I think Calvin summarized well. Which, go from polarizing figure to polarizing figure, Jesus to Calvin, right? But Calvin said that the shepherd, the pastor, the shepherd, is to have two voices, one for welcoming the sheep and one for driving away the wolves, which I think is perfectly epitomized in Jesus. Perfectly epitomized in Jesus. What does he do to the sinner, to the prostitute, to the leper, to the blind, to those who have been outcast? What is he? I mean, he welcomes them.
Brings them to the fold.
He brings them into the fold. He looks out and he had compassion on the crowds because they were like a sheep without they were like sheep without a shepherd. That's what the Gospels say. But he certainly had a voice for driving out wolves. And if we don't have a category for that, if we don't have a category for that voice of driving out wolves, now, if all you ever do is drive out wolves, so much so that the sheep are scared to come around, then that's the opposite problem.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you're so welcoming that you're welcoming the wolves into the fold, then nothing Jesus said made sense. Nothing he said made sense.
I think a lot of people don't realize the mental gymnastics you have to do. And I would encourage our listeners to question those when you run into it. I know a lot of people that listen to us go to churches that might have, big divides in their theological persuasions, be it liberally or conservatively liberal. Or, excuse me, theologically conservative or theologically liberal. My apologies. Question them. Don't let them do the mental gymnastics. Just like Josiah pointed out there, I'm like, this is an explicit statement. How do you account for that? And they're probably going to do some gymnastics so they can desystematize that part of Scripture from the other part of Scripture and take out the connections and the relationships. Don't let them do it. The Old Testament in the New Testament, that's scripture. It's God's word. It's all God's word. It's all for profit. It's all good for reproof.
So one of the gymnastics that I do see is, regardless of how clearly false something is, or a statement is, or a teaching is, if you correct it, the response is something like a reference to Psalm 105:15, touch not the Lord's anointed, do the prophets no harm. So analyze that. What are the gymnastics at play there?
Well, I mean, there's first you have hypocritical application, like, right? Okay, so you want to apply that standard for God's prophets. Well, I'm going to be able to kill some false prophets here soon, and Mr. Copley might be close to on that list. If Copeland, excuse me, if he, you know what I mean, like, that's inconsistent. Most of the time you talk to these people, they're gonna be like, well, we're not going to put them down just because, we're not going to kill them just because they had one false prophecy. That's the Old Testament. And then they go to they go to the Psalms, touch not the Lord's anointed.
Yeah.
Moreover, prove to me they're the Lord's anointed.
That's the point in question.
What's that? Yeah, what's that? Give me the definition of that. That's how everything works.
Right.
Tell me.
And
I don't think they even know.
And if you're going to appeal to that definition, you have to appeal to it in Old Testament terms. You can't. You can't. You can't now. If you're going to use the terms "Lord's anointed" from the Old Testament, then you have to go back and look at what did the author originally. Going back to what we talked about last time, this is basic exegesis. This is fundamental to understanding the Bible. Is understanding what the author meant when he wrote the words. What did the author mean when he wrote "Lord's anointed"? Well, he had a Mosaic understanding of what that meant. So go back to Moses. Oh, well, we can't go back to Moses. We can't. We gotta unhitch. Okay, fine. Then
shut up.
Then stop quoting Psalm 104.
That's my point. I'm like, half the times you guys don't even want to talk about this. Don't bring this up now. Touch not the Lord's anointed. And second off, it's like if you have a law that says touch not the Lord's anointed. Okay, like within that law, you're gonna have a definition section and say here are the criterion for being the Lord's anointed. It turns out we have that criterion too. And most of the people you tell me not to touch don't meet that criterion, in my opinion. I'm just a layman though, so yeah.
Yeah, and it's begging the question. Like, that's the whole point in question. If we're saying something is a false teaching or someone is a false teacher, and you're like, touch not the Lord's anointed, that's the point in question. Even if they're ordained,
that's a disputed fact here.
Right, that's the disputed fact. That's the whole argument. Yeah,
that's
contention. Yeah. And what do you say to that? And that's a good thing to point out. It just, like, listen, you're not even attacking my argument, which is the worst. I personally hate it. My argument here is that he's not the Lord's anointed. If I thought he was the Lord anointed, I wouldn't be talking about him.
Right.
Or if I did, I wouldn't say it was a false teacher. I would just say, hey, this is a potentially false teaching. Teacher versus teaching. That's a good distinction, Seth.
Right.
I hadn't heard that one before. Or at least sussed out like that, you know what I mean?
So
yeah, it's the repeated false teachings that are going to start to lead to asking the questions: is do we have a false teacher? Because
someone who steals once.
False teachers don't come from nowhere, and they don't start in a vacuum.
Right.
They start with false teaching, and that false teaching is what should start making people wary of.
So if we really love our brothers and sisters, because we don't want them to fall into being a false teacher and suffer the fires of hell, we would start, when we start to see these false teachings, we'd be like, whoa, buddy. And how does this play into local church membership? Because you're always talking about that, Joey. That's like every time you post on Sunday. How does that tie in?
Yeah, that's.
Did I spoil it? Sorry.
No, that was one of the questions I was going to ask.
Good.
But now since you asked it, I get to answer it.
Wait, before we leave this, I want to go back real quick. That the text of, I mentioned it earlier, that the author is referring to something when he says touch not the Lord's anointed. And the very next line is, "Do my prophet no harm." So again, we have a clear definition of what these things are. But who are the anointed?
They are a prophet.
Who are the anointed ones in the Old Testament? The anointed ones are the priests of Aaron. They're the Aaronic priesthood, right? Mm-hmm. That's who's being talked about. And if you want a New Testament definition, then we're going to go to how did Paul talk about how to have leadership in the church, and what he gave qualifications for leadership, right? In the same way there were qualifications for leadership in the Old Covenant.
Oh, wow.
Qualifications for leadership in the New Covenant. And so if we're going to talk about Lord's anointed, then we have to go back and talk about the qualifications for what that looks like in the New Covenant.
We're talking about ecclesiology at this point.
Right.
Yeah.
So now
Yeah.
if we're gonna have a one-to-one relationship here, let's talk about this person, and let's talk about is this person an anointed one in the sense that we're using this word according to Paul's definition of anointed one, which I don't know if he would use that term, but it based on that definition, based on the qualifications that he gives in 1 Timothy and Titus, or has this person, by what Paul says is qualifying, disqualified themselves, probably by something that they weren't even teaching, but just the way they were living their life, and you see but nobody wants to talk about that.
Right?
They just want to lob bombs with a verse.
I see what you're saying, right? So like, it's really easy to say, "Don't touch the Lord's anointed," and when we're like, okay, here is the New Testament equivalent of the Lord's anointed, and here, based on the the apostles' writings, here's the list. Your guy doesn't meet that list,
right?
But no one wants to talk about that because we as Americans, just generally American Protestants, which is what we're American Protestants broadly, and a lot of time, I think people don't. I'm trying to be polite here. People don't want to be honest about that, I guess, is my take on that.
No, people don't want to be honest about the qualifications of a minister. They don't want and there's forgotten qualifications in there. That if you go back,
they don't want to talk about ecclesiology at all.
If you go back,
they're low church.
Yeah, right. If you go back and read the qualifications for a minister, that's a high bar. It's not, and I mean, yes, the text does say, Paul does say, the person who desires this desires an honorable thing or desires a good thing, and of course that's true. But they also desire a very weighty thing. And that's why the qualifications are very serious. Go anyway. Right. So that I just wanted to cinch that up. Now,
I think that's a good point, man. That's a good
question
point.
You're going to answer.
I'll use that as a springboard to Justin's question. He asked, what is the role of the local church in addressing and dealing with these false teachers and false teachings? And when you talk about the qualifications of a minister, that's huge in all of this. Okay. I am someone who looked at those qualifications, who was on staff as an associate pastor at a church, and looked at those qualifications and realized I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing. Right? So first, before anyone accuses me of hypocrisy with what I say next, I've applied this to myself, stepped down, refused a salary, okay? So that's where I'm coming from. Secondly, when you look at the role of the local church, it is the elders who are tasked, as Seth mentioned already, with being shepherds, right? If you have elders or pastors at your church who don't shepherd you and don't guard you and don't look out for your soul, and at times that includes even rebuking you or correcting you, they're not biblical elders.
Right.
They're not functioning biblically. They're not acting like biblical pastors, right? And
they are the shepherd of your soul. If they're not caring for your soul, then they are not a shepherd, because what are they a shepherd of?
Right. Exactly. So the role then is for them to teach sound doctrine so that you know it and you're teaching it to your family, and you can recognize, the best standard for recognizing false doctrine is in contrast to the truth. If you know the truth, it's much harder for you to be deceived. And I would say beyond that, people in America have, again, coming from the background I come from, where I stepped away recognizing I was not meeting some of these qualifications, right? or that there were commands for this position that I was struggling to fulfill in a local church, right? People have a huge problem with submission and the idea of submission and submitting to local elders, to the extent that when people today, like, say I'm in a group on the internet, on Facebook or something, and someone asks, what do you guys think about this particular interpretation of the Bible? My first response is almost always, have you talked to your elders about it? What do they say? Right? Now, I'll talk to people if I know where they're coming from. I know they're in a church and they're submitting to their elders, and they come to me and say, what do you think about this? I'm happy to have that conversation. Right.
Yeah.
But when you see someone who they're asking a question like, my church teaches this and I don't like it, so I want validation that my disliking it is justified, I'm going to be like, no, submit to your elders. What are you doing? Like,
yeah,
and that's for the benefit and protection of your soul. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think this all
Definitely
stems from this. This may be a tangent, but I think this all stems, like, as an American, as Americans, I think we think that unsubmissiveness kind of runs in our blood. That's the way. That's the way that we were bred, and that's the way that we were made, and that's the way that we were founded. But I would argue that's not the case. I would argue that the founding fathers and the patriots here on these shores longed to submit biblically and wanted to submit biblically, but the problem was the people that I'm talking civilly, not in the church, but the civil magistrate that was over them was making it impossible for them to submit. It is impossible for us to continue to submit to this because what we're being asked to submit to is unjust, right?
Yeah.
But what we've done is transplant that idea of not being submissive because we don't like it. Well, that is not what was happening. Now, certainly the things that were unjust are things that they didn't like, of course. Granted.
Right.
But
people don't understand how long it took to get an actual war to go down.
Right.
Like, they don't know how many emissaries were sent and how much these people took.
Because
it was a weighty thing.
Is that war? Right. The war should be our last option, and they didn't even declare war. They declared independence. They just said we want to just be independent. And the British are the one who started sending troops over. So the idea of not wanting to submit because we're Americans or not wanting to submit because we have this American gusto or fire is a fundamental misunderstanding of.
It's fake.
The American founding,
manufactured.
And George Washington, if he were here and heard you say that, would slap you in the face. And he was an Anglican, right? Like he was he would smack you. And most of these guys understood the weightiness of not submitting. Not submitting is a big deal. And you're not just going to uproot and say, "Well, I feel like I'm not being fed at this church." Well,
and it's because they appreciated hierarchy for what it is. Hierarchy literally means holy order. It is a thing of beauty. Hierarchy is good. Obviously, man can make hierarchy sinful, but I think you're right. Like, this does stem because no one wants to get under a church. Everyone wants to have their own, every church wants to have its own liberty and freedom, doesn't want to be held down by a singular body, either nationwide, statewide, region-wide. I tell you what, if I were to tell most Christians that, like, my elders will literally refuse to give me communion if I'm living in sin, unrepentant sin, they're just like, what?
They would say, "Why?"
I'm like,
They would say, "Why don't you leave?" Because I'm in sin. They're doing the right thing. They're doing the right thing by warning me about a false teacher. They're doing the right thing by refusing me the table. They're doing the right thing because they're shepherding my soul. And a pastor that doesn't do those things is shepherding nothing. They're not saving you. They're not preserving you. They're not helping you. They're doing nothing.
So what?
We're responsible then.
Yeah.
But go ahead, Josiah.
What? With this idea of them shepherding us, what are the marks of a biblical teacher? A biblical, not a false one, but a true one.
Well, obviously, someone who meets the qualifications in 1 Timothy and Titus. But that's just how to get in the door. Like that's just that's the bar you got to get over. Once you clear that bar, obviously there are good ones and there are better ones and whatever.
Sure.
But I think one thing that is lost in this whole, and we've talked about this before, but the idea that the gathering of the saints on the Lord's Day is for the saints, and that the pastor shepherd makes it about addressing sin among the saints. That that
specific group of saints.
Yeah. That he's walking in. That you're walking in intentionally with your gloves down because you need to get smacked in the face and you need to be shown your sin, and not in a heavy-handed way, but in the way a father would correct his son. In the way a father would correct his son, he would come to you and say, this is wrong. You're wrong. And you need to repent. You need to.
I see. And I think a lot of people don't. To them, that just seems so antique, and that doesn't fit in with our modern notions of what Christianity is, and we how many people go to a church where their pastor doesn't know their name? Mm-hmm. Isn't that crazy?
How can he shepherd you?
I'm not trying to hit on big churches. I'm not trying to be ungracious here. I get that some churches are just big, and some of those churches have staffs of 24 deacons and elders, and that can functionally shepherd them, at least derivatively through.
And that's, it's a very. I don't want to say there's a lot of there. We don't have time to unpack all of it, but the idea that you have one central figure, central figure, and he is the guy, right? Mm-hmm. That is he is not as he is a part of a team of elders. He is the shepherd of the souls of the church. But I have an elder. Not only are the elders plural responsible for my soul, but I have an elder, personal elder, who is responsible for my soul. And he is the shepherd of my soul, and he's in my house, and he's with my family, and he sees me, and he's going to call me on my stuff, and that's a whole another conversation for another.
It is, and I'm gonna do one more quip on that, if you don't mind, because this is just so prevalent in Christian culture now. Why? So a lot of churches have started doing connect groups or life groups or something like that. Something that I think is potentially advantageous in different contexts. And I think it's always a good idea to get like a men's fellowship or even just a whole church fellowship together once a month, or however your church does it, depending on the size. But is that the same as getting instruction under under elders that have met the criterion? Because to me, it doesn't seem like that personally. I'm a little wary of life groups, a little wary of sheep leading sheep, so to speak.
I would say it does not meet the criteria.
Yeah, so they're okay in and of themselves. Like, that's totally good for three Christians get together. That, especially if you guys' passion is studying theology and the Word, and it's great. I wouldn't say that substitute you get getting that one-on-one shepherd model of hey, how are you looking at porn this week? Hey, why are your knuckles bloody? Have you been punching stuff because you're angry?
Yeah. Hey,
your wife mentioned you've been having a really rough week. Let's talk about it. Right. That's important. That's really important. That's the point of the church together is the act of a brotherhood. Take care of each other.
I've noticed that your discipline of your child is way too harsh, and or on the flip side, I've noticed that your discipline of your child is actually really lacking. Man, that hurts. But in the same way that you would want to discipline your child faithfully so that they grow up to be the kind of person that you want them to be.
Right.
Yeah. You want your elder to discipline you, and how much
does that
want your elder You want your elder to protect you from these false teachers. You want your leadership to protect you from these false teachers. And if you go to your elder or your pastor or whatever you call them, if you go to them and you say, "Hey, I'm concerned about this false teaching. I'm concerned about could you read this, because it's not coming off. It's coming off weird to me." And they blow you off, or they just different strokes for different folks. It's
right.
Time out. You've got to.
How serious are you taking this?
Serious questions. Questions.
I got to say that. Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, how much do they have to love you to be willing to have an uncomfortable conversation with you?
That's right.
It's hard, man. It's hard.
So last thing I want to...
I think that's a good question. I mean, that was a good discussion. I think it always is going to lead to ecclesiology, which is, just churchology, but church bodyology, guys, for listeners out there.
Last thing, kind of wrapping up here. How do we view sort of false teaching and false teachers in their relationship to Appalachia? How does it specifically play out here? How do we relate kind of this topic to our geography, our culture in Appalachia? Go ahead,
well,
Justin.
Everybody should go back and listen to the interview with Dennis Bills that we did when he talked about he talked about Presbyterianism, specifically Presbyterianism in Appalachia. But one of the things he talked about was how the geography of Appalachia made Presbyterianism in particular very difficult, because Presbyterianism is naturally connectedness. And so when you have a geography that naturally isolates, when you have a geography that by its nature makes people just kind of pocket together, man, that's really dangerous. That's just the reason
Perfect storm.
The reason you have snake handling stuff going on in Appalachia is because you have a bunch of people who have been isolated, who have never been called to task, who have never been challenged on anything, and now it's so ingrained in everything that when you take a TV camera in there, it's the novelty now. It's baked into the cake. You can't unbake the cake. It's already in there.
Well, yeah, they didn't have any leadership either to say, they read the end of Mark and they're like, "Oh, hey, that seems like a really good idea. We should do that." I'm like,
Well, and you also had, and I understand the desire to want to plant churches and want to spread the gospel. You also had a lowering of that bar of qualifications for elders. All of that stuff comes down because of, we got to get the gospel out. And we got to cross the Appalachians. We got to go over the frontier. And we're now, generations later, seeing the result of all that, of a wasteland of theological understanding at all. That you could quote a hymn as well as you could quote the Bible, and people think it's the same. Like if you read from the red whatever book from whatever down the street, that's just as good as reading from the Bible. Quoting that line from that hymn. There's just such a and so that makes us really, 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 really vulnerable to these kind of things. It's almost like it's almost like I think we've talked about this before, but when you have AIDS, you don't die of AIDS, you die of the common cold or the flu or something like that, because you're immunocompromised. And I think as Appalachians, we are immunocompromised, and that's why we see these. We talked to Josh Robinson about the revival, the quote unquote revival in Logan. Those kinds of flashes in the pan, that we are prime targets for those kind of things, because we are sheep without a shepherd. We are sheep without a shepherd.
And I think in terms, you look at all the small country churches we have, which you talk about pockets that are largely independent, but also don't have a lot of resources. And so, how are they going to where are they going to find these highly qualified elders, people who are educated in theology and in the faith? It's going to be really difficult.
Yep.
But
and I think to play off what Seth said, I think West Virginia is particularly susceptible to some sorts of false teaching because of the economic hardship and lack of hope that we've had here over the last even just I mean, honestly, 70 years. Just it's been going downhill for a minute, you know.
Yeah.
Even since the 1950s and 60s. So I think that played a lot into it. I think
Sure.
some of these wolves are cunning.
when you have an economically depressed people, what are they going to look for but prosperity type teaching? They're going to look for false prophets to come and make those kinds of claims.
Right.
And
It's playing the spiritual lottery, man.
to play on it and to play on emotions and to manipulate and do all those things, which again I think we are dangerously underprepared for, which we've seen. I mean, we've seen Rodney Howard Brown come up here. We've seen those big huge tent revivals. We've seen those really really dangerous, almost to the level of false teacher guys come in here and do a ton of damage and break people and leave bodies in their wake, and it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah. So closing thoughts.
Don't be a.
I'll go.
Okay, go ahead.
Good. Okay, sorry. We still have this, like, we're getting better on the delay, guys. Sorry, and we're working it out with this remote gig. But my closing thoughts are really simple. Every Christian has a responsibility of defending the church, just in varying degrees based on position, and that includes from within. And if you don't catch someone and you let them keep on doing false teaching after false teaching and kind of let them systematize that in their brain, it's going to be really hard to pull them away from a false teacher. So if you love your neighbor, we're not talking about purity of the doctrine as in perfect doctrine. We're just talking doctrine that is not anti-orthodox, hetero-orthodox.
Yeah.
Those are my closing thoughts.
I would say don't be a heresy hound that's looking for false teaching in every nook and cranny, but at the same time, you cannot be oblivious to the fact that it exists, that it could very well exist in your church, that it could exist. It certainly exists on the internet, and it certainly exists among famous people, famous pastors, famous, internet celebrity pastors, whatever. It probably exists in some form there. And the safest place you can go is to a church with a biblically qualified elder who is going to call you to the mat. So your favorite pastor should not be some guy on the internet. It shouldn't be some guy who posts Facebook things. It should be your pastor. It should be someone who knows you intimately. Your pastor who knows you intimately is going to call you to the mat on some stuff that nobody else would. And somebody who would even go so far as to withhold communion from you because of your sin. And that because that's how serious this all is. That's how serious this is. So, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoy this content, make sure you like if it's available on the format you're listening on. Share it on social media. Let us know on our Facebook page what topics you would like to see us discuss in the future. Remember the Lord, fight for your families, fight for your homes, fight for your children. This has been the Mountain Musket.